The scream was not human. It was a sound of pure porcine terror, high and sharp, followed by a sickening thud that shook the very ground under Elara's worn boots. Dust, thick and choking, billowed up from the far corner of the cleared patch, a brown cloud against the suffocating green wall of Kudzu. She was running before the sound had fully died, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. Pip, his lanky teenage frame moving with a surprising speed, was already ahead of her, his face a pale mask of alarm. The other hogs, a grunting, snorting mass of pink and black, had scattered back from the site of the commotion, their usual placid rooting forgotten. They milled nervously, their small eyes wide. They reached the edge of the dust cloud just as it began to settle, revealing a dark, jagged maw in the earth. A hole. A hole that hadn't been there an hour ago. And at the bottom of it, wedged in the dirt and shattered roots, lay the general, her biggest boar, frighteningly still. Pip let out a small, strangled gasp. "Is he?" He couldn't finish the sentence. Elara didn't answer. She dropped to her knees at the edge of the crater, the raw earth crumbling under her hands. The smell that rose from the hole was ancient and cool, a scent of deep stone and trapped night. The general wasn't moving. For one terrible second, she thought his back was broken, that her entire gamble, her whole mad enterprise, had just collapsed into this forgotten wound in the earth. Then, a shudder ran through the boar's massive flank, followed by a low, pained grunt. He was alive. Trapped, but alive. "Rope," she said, her voice tight and focused. "From the barn. And the big lantern." Pip scrambled to his feet and sprinted away. Elara stayed, her eyes tracing the edges of the hole. It wasn't a sinkhole. Not exactly. As the last of the dust cleared, she saw it. A rough curve of fitted stones, mossy and dark, forming a distinct ring just below the surface. The tons of soil deposited by decades of kudzu rot had hidden it completely. Her hogs, with their relentless, powerful snouts, had finally rooted down to the one thing the kudzu could not digest: stone. It was the rim of a well. A deep, stone-lined well nobody knew was there. A well on 85 acres of land everyone in the county had agreed was worth less than nothing. 8 months earlier, the laughter had been the worst part. It wasn't loud or cruel, not at first. It was a low, rumbling wave of pity and disbelief that washed over the courthouse steps as the auctioneer's gavel fell. "Sold to the young lady in gray for $250. Mr. Redding, the county land agent, turned to her with a smile that never touched his eyes. He was a man whose softness was a kind of armor. "Well, Miss Elara," he said, his voice oozing a false warmth she had come to recognize as the sound of a predator circling. "Congratulations. You are now the proud owner of the Miller catastrophe." The men around him chuckled. The Miller catastrophe was 85 acres of land, so thoroughly consumed by kudzu that the original farmhouse, barn, and fences were just soft green lumps on the landscape. The vine had swallowed everything, creating a silent rolling ocean of green that choked the trees and smothered the soil. It was considered a blight, a dead zone. "A woman alone can't work a place like that," one farmer muttered, just loud enough for her to hear. "A team of men with mules couldn't work that place." Redding patted her shoulder in a gesture of condescending comfort. "Now, I did offer you a fair price for your late father's 40 acres. Good, clear bottomland. You could have had a fine, respectable start. Instead," he gestured vaguely toward the kudzu strangled hills, "this. I do hope you know what you're doing." Elara just nodded, her face as still as a pond on a windless day. She tucked the deed into the pocket of her worn dress and met his gaze. "I do, Mr. Redding." She did not say that his fair price for her father's land was half its worth, a lowball offer aimed at a grieving daughter he assumed was desperate. She did not say that she had watched him cheat 2 other families that year. She simply took the $250 she'd earned from selling that prime bottomland, the land everyone wanted, and bought the one piece of ground nobody did. As she walked away from the courthouse, the whispers followed her like burrs on a wool coat. Lost her mind. Pity. Her father was such a sensible man. She'll be begging for work by Christmas. Elara did not look back. She kept her eyes fixed on the horizon, on the green, silent hills that were now hers. She had the deed, $100 left to her name, and an idea. It was a desperate idea, a ridiculous idea, but it was hers. And in her mind, she was already doing the arithmetic, the cold, hard arithmetic of survival that had been her only companion since her father passed. 85 acres, $100, and the unshakable belief that a thing's true worth is rarely what people are willing to pay for it. The land remembers what the people forget. Her neighbor, old Silas, had told her once, and Elara was counting on it. The old miller's shack was little more than a husk, but the roof was mostly sound, and the stone fireplace drew true. The Kudzu had tried to claim it, sending thick, hairy runners through the window frames and under the door, but the structure had held. Elara spent the first week with a scythe and an axe, cutting a clearing around the house, a small island of bare earth in the suffocating green sea. The work was brutal. The air was thick and humid under the canopy of leaves, and the vines, some as thick as her arm, fought back. By evening, her hands were raw, her muscles screaming in protest. She would sit on her porch, watching the sun set over the monstrous rolling hills of her new property, and do the arithmetic again. The numbers hadn't changed. 1 woman, an axe, 85 acres. It was a math that led only to failure. That was when she walked the 5 miles to the livestock auction. She stood at the back, quiet and watchful, ignoring the curious glances. She wasn't there for the fine-looking cattle or the sturdy mules. She waited until the end of the day, when the pens held only the scraggly, unwanted stock. She bought 8 half-grown shoats, a mix of breeds with wiry hair and long snouts, for $7 apiece. They were lean and hungry, considered poor stock by the local farmers who prized fat, corn-fed pigs. Elara saw something else. She saw 8 living plows, 8 relentless rooting machines. When she drove them home in a borrowed cart, the whispers started again. Now she's throwing good money after bad. Kudzu pigs. They'll either starve or get lost in that mess. She built a small, sturdy pen of reclaimed timber and wire near the shack, a holding area. The next day, she began her real work. She didn't try to fight the whole ocean of green at once. Instead, she marked off a single acre, a square patch bordering her clearing. She spent 4 days stringing a low, tough fence of woven wire around it. It was slow, painstaking labor, sinking the posts deep and stretching the wire until her fingers bled. On the 5th day, she opened the gate to the smaller pen and let the hogs into the acre of Kudzu. For a moment, they stood blinking in the strange green-filtered light, uncertain. Then, the boldest of the bunch, a black boar with a formidable snout, lowered his head and began to root. The others followed. It was the sound of her hope taking root, the sound of snuffling, grunting, tearing industry. She leaned against a fence post, exhausted but satisfied, and watched them work. They weren't just eating the leaves, they were digging, churning the soil, ripping up the massive, starchy taproots of the kudzu. The vine could survive being cut, grazed, or burned. Its power was in its root system, a deep, tenacious network that held the earth captive. But the hogs were attacking its very heart. That evening, old man Silas trudged over from his neighboring homestead. He was a man who looked as old as the hills, his face a road map of wrinkles, his hands gnarled like oak roots. He didn't say hello. He just stood beside her, watching the hogs tear into the green tangle. "They said you bought the blight," he said, his voice a low rasp. "I did," Elara replied. He nodded slowly, a thoughtful look in his pale blue eyes. "My grandfather told me, before all this was here, this was good land. Had a spring on it," he said. "But folks get lazy. They let things go. Then they forget what was there to begin with." He spat a stream of tobacco juice. "The land remembers what the people forget. You just have to find a way to ask it the right question." He looked at the hogs, a flicker of something like respect in his gaze. "Looks like you found your question." He turned to leave, then paused. "A woman alone needs a good dog." The next day he came back with a scruffy brown puppy, all paws and ears. Elara had no money to pay him. He just grunted and said the dog's mother had too many to feed anyway. Elara named the pup Digger. A week later, a boy appeared at the edge of her clearing. He was maybe 12, small for his age, with watchful eyes and a halo of dusty blonde hair. He didn't speak, just stood and watched the hogs. Elara recognized him as Pip, the youngest son of the sullen, hard-luck Thatcher family. He came every day, silent as a shadow. Elara would leave a biscuit and a cup of water on a stump for him. On the fourth day, he spoke. "That big black one," he said, pointing. "He acts like a general." Elara smiled. "Then that's his name." Pip began to help. He hauled water, mended the fence, and named the rest of the hogs. Sergeant, Major, Corporal. He talked to them in a low, conspiratorial murmur, treating the 7 boars and 1 sow like a disciplined army under his command. He was the first person, other than Silas, who didn't look at her project with pity or scorn. He looked at it with wonder. He saw what she saw, not a foolish woman with a pack of scraggly pigs, but a general deploying her troops against an intractable enemy, 1 acre at a time. By June, the first acre was cleared. It was a shocking sight. A patch of rich, dark earth scarred with trenches and pits, littered with the shredded remnants of kudzu roots. It looked like a battlefield, and in a way, it was. Elara moved the fence, enclosing a new acre of green, and let her porcine army advance. The hogs were fatter now, sleek and muscular. The diet of protein-rich leaves and starchy roots was agreeing with them. Pip took to weighing them with a spring scale and a sling, meticulously recording their progress in a tattered notebook. "The general gained 11 pounds last month," he'd announced with grave importance. The cleared earth, left to settle, proved Silas right. It was good soil, dark and loamy, enriched by decades of decaying kudzu leaves and the tilling of the hogs. Elara planted a small kitchen garden in one corner. Beans, squash, potatoes. They grew with a fierce, urgent vitality, as if grateful for the sun. The town's opinion began to shift from outright mockery to a kind of grudging curiosity. Wagons would slow on the county road that ran past her property. Faces would peer out, marveling at the expanding square of brown earth encroaching on the monolithic green. Mr. Redding drove by in his polished buggy every other week. He never stopped, but she could feel his eyes on her, his expression no longer amused. It was sharp, calculating. He was redoing his own arithmetic, she suspected. The small victories kept her going. The first tender bean she picked from her garden. The day Pip found a rusty hand-forged horseshoe buried a foot deep in the cleared soil, a relic of the forgotten Miller farm. The quiet evenings spent with Silas, sharing a cup of chicory coffee on her porch while Digger slept at their feet. Silas taught her things her father never had: how to read the clouds, how to bank a fire to last the night, how to listen to the land. "It talks," he'd say. "You just have to learn the language." But there were setbacks. One of the Hogs, Corporal, sickened and died despite her best efforts. It was a harsh blow, a reminder of how fragile her enterprise was. She and Pip buried him under the old oak at the edge of the property. Pip carved his name into the bark with a small knife. It was a child's gesture, but it felt important. It felt like honoring a fallen soldier. The arithmetic was always there, a quiet hum in the back of her mind. Cost of wire, cost of grain supplement, potential weight of the hogs, market price per pound. It was a tightrope walk with no safety net. One sick herd, one broken fence, one bad storm could send her tumbling into ruin. The loneliness was a quiet ache, most potent at dusk when the world settled into a hush. She was a woman alone. The phrase echoed the town's judgment, and sometimes, in the deepest hours of the night, it felt true. She would stand on her porch, looking at the dark, silent mass of the uncleared land, and a wave of doubt would wash over her. It was too much. 85 acres was a kingdom, and she was just one person. Then she would hear the soft grunt of a hog settling in for the night, or feel Digger's wet nose press against her hand, and the feeling would pass. She was not entirely alone. She had her army. She had her small, strange family. And she had the work. The work was honest and it was real. You could see the progress at the end of every day. You could feel the reclaimed earth under your feet. And that was a truth more solid than any number. The day the butcher came from Clayton was the day everything changed. He was a big, stern German named Schmidt, known for being ruthlessly fair. He'd heard the rumors of the Kudzu pigs and had come to see for himself. He walked the fence line, his eyes missing nothing. He watched the hogs rooting, his expression unreadable. "They say you clear land with them," he said. It wasn't a question. "They do the work," Elara said simply. Schmidt grunted. "Let me see one." Pip, with a quiet expertise that impressed even the butcher, skillfully separated the sergeant from the herd and guided him into the holding pen. Schmidt ran a practiced hand over the boar's back and flanks. He checked his teeth. He felt the solid muscle beneath the hide. He was silent for a long time. Elara held her breath. "They are not fed on corn," he finally said, his voice flat. "No," Elara admitted. "Kudzu roots mostly, some grain. It is a different kind of meat," he mused, more to himself than to her. "An old world flavor. Foraged. People in the city will pay for that. They are tired of soft, corn-fed pork." He looked directly at her, his gaze sharp and appraising. "I will buy them, all of them, when they are ready. I will pay 20 cents a pound, live weight. And I will give you a contract." 20 cents a pound was 2 cents higher than the going rate. A contract was security. It was vindication. It was the arithmetic finally adding up in her favor. She shook his hand, her own rough and calloused against his. It had worked. Her mad idea had actually worked. The news of Schmidt's contract spread through the county like wildfire. The laughter was gone now, replaced by whispers of a different sort. 20 cents a pound. That girl's going to be rich. clearing that land for free and getting paid for the pigs that do it? She's cleverer than she looks. The pity had curdled into envy. August arrived like the open door of a furnace. The sky turned a hard, metallic blue, and the sun beat down with a relentless, punishing heat. The creeks shrank, leaving cracked mudflats where water used to flow. The corn in the fields of her neighbors turned yellow and brittle before it could tassel. The land grew thirsty, then desperate. Elara's garden survived only because of the 2 rain barrels she kept by the shack, which she rationed out with a careful hand. Her hogs were better off than most livestock. They were hardy creatures, and the deep, shaded tangle of the remaining kudzu offered them some respite from the sun. The broad leaves of the vine still drew moisture from deep in the earth, providing them with sustenance. But water was the problem. The small stream that cut across a corner of her property was down to a muddy trickle. Elara and Pip began hauling buckets from Silas's well, a deep, reliable source that had never run dry. It was back-breaking work, 2 trips in the morning and 2 in the cool of the evening, but it kept the animals alive. The drought changed the town. Fear made people watchful and suspicious. Hay became scarce and expensive. Farmers began selling off cattle they couldn't afford to water, flooding the market and driving prices down. The easy frontier generosity was replaced by a grim, protective hoarding of resources. Fights broke out at the town well. The atmosphere grew as tense and brittle as the parched ground. Redding's visits became more frequent. He'd rein in his buggy at her fence line, his face a mask of false concern. "A terrible dry spell, Miss Elara," he'd say, wiping his brow with a silk handkerchief. "A real trial for a woman on her own. I imagine it's hard keeping those animals watered." "We manage," she'd reply, her voice even. Of course," he'd say smoothly. "But a property without a reliable well, its value plummets in a time like this. Tax assessments are coming up, you know. The county will have to adjust values based on resources." It was a veiled threat, a seed of doubt planted. He was reminding her of his power, of the official levers he could pull. He was letting her know that the land he'd once scorned was now a subject of his interest. She saw the greed in his eyes, a hard, shiny glint. He looked at her cleared acres, at the healthy hogs, and he saw a prize he had let slip through his fingers. He wanted it back. The pressure mounted. One evening, Maeve Thatcher, Pip's mother, appeared at her gate. She was a proud, worn-down woman who had always looked at Elara with a mixture of pity and resentment. Tonight, her pride was gone. "Our well is dry," she said, her voice cracking. "The cows, they're suffering." She couldn't bring herself to ask directly. The shame was too great. Elara looked at the woman's desperate face and saw the face of the whole county. She thought of the whispers, the mockery. She could have turned her away. She could have savored the moment. Instead, she handed Maeve 2 full buckets of water she had just hauled from Silas's. "Take these for tonight," she said gently. "We'll find a way." Maeve began to cry, silent, ragged tears. Being right is its own kind of reply, Elara thought. But kindness is a better one. She knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that the drought was a test, not just of her endurance, but of her character. It was a crisis that was stripping everyone down to their essential selves. Some, like Redding, were revealed as predators. Others, like Maeve, were humbled. Elara was discovering who she was meant to be, not just a survivor, but a provider. The day the ground collapsed was the 23rd day without rain. The air was so dry it felt like it could crackle and burn. She and Pip were moving the fence line again, preparing to unleash the hogs on the 5th acre. The animals were restless, grunting with thirst, their hides caked with dust. The general, always the most aggressive rooter, was tearing at a stubborn patch near an outcrop of rocks. He was agitated, digging with a frantic energy, as if he smelled something deep in the earth. That's when it happened. The scream, the thud, the billowing dust. They ran, their hearts pounding in the suffocating heat, and they found the hole. After Pip ran for the rope and lantern, Elara knelt, peering into the darkness. The air that rose from the depths was cool, almost cold, and carried a faint, clean smell of wet stone. It was the smell of salvation. By the time Pip returned, Silas was with him, drawn by the commotion. Together, the three of them worked. They fashioned a sling from the thickest rope, and with Silas directing and Pip acting as a counterweight, Elara carefully lowered herself a few feet into the opening. The general was grunting weakly, one leg twisted at an ugly angle. But he was alive. It took them an hour of careful, muscle-straining work to get the sling around the boar's massive torso and haul him, inch by painstaking inch, out of the hole. He was bruised and shaken, his leg clearly broken, but he was safe. While Silas and Pip tended to the animal, fashioning a crude splint, Elara turned her attention back to the hole. "Lower the lantern," she said to Pip. He tied the rope to the handle and slowly paid it out, the circle of yellow light descending into the blackness. 10 feet down. 20. 30. The light seemed to get smaller, a tiny star swallowed by the earth. Then, a flash, a glint of reflected light. "Hold it there," Elara breathed. She lay flat on the ground, her head over the edge, and stared. Far below, the lantern light danced on a perfectly still, dark surface. It was water. A vast, deep pool of it, protected from the sun, shielded from the drought, waiting in the cool, silent dark. "Silas," she whispered, her voice filled with awe. "Come look." The old man knelt beside her, his ancient eyes peering into the abyss. He watched the light on the water for a full minute, his face unreadable. Then he straightened up, a slow, wondering smile spreading across his face. He looked at the cleared land, at the woman beside him, and he nodded. "The land remembers," he said softly. "It just waited for someone patient enough to ask." News of the well traveled faster than a prairie fire. By morning, a small crowd of neighbors had gathered at Elara's fence line. They didn't come to mock or whisper. They stood in silence, their faces etched with a combination of awe and desperate hope. They looked at the dark opening in the ground as if it were a shrine. They were farmers, and they understood the miracle of water in a time of drought. Elara, Pip, and Silas had worked through the night, building a sturdy frame and a windlass over the well opening. The first bucket they raised was clear and cold, the sweetest water Elara had ever tasted. It was real. Her salvation was real. Just before noon, Mr. Redding arrived. He didn't come in his buggy. He came in a wagon, flanked by two grim-faced men from the county office. He carried a rolled-up map and an air of absolute authority. He did not ask permission to enter her property. He simply unlatched the gate and strode toward the well as if he owned it. "A remarkable discovery, Miss Elara," he said, his voice ringing with a false official heartiness. "Truly a blessing for the whole community." Elara stood her ground, her hand resting on the new wooden frame of the windlass. Digger growled low in his throat beside her. "It's a blessing for my farm, Mr. Redding." Redding unrolled his map on the hood of his wagon with a flourish. It was a county plat map, crisscrossed with lines and notations. He tapped a specific spot with a manicured finger. "As you can see from the official survey of 1888, A 20-foot utility and water access easement runs right through this section of your property, centered on this point here, what the old maps designate as the Miller Spring. Of course, it was long thought to be dried up, but the easement remains. The well and access to it belongs to the county. A stunned silence fell over the gathered farmers. It was a bold lie, delivered with the full force of bureaucratic certainty. Elara looked at the map, then back at his smug face. She felt a surge of cold fury, but her voice remained steady. "I see no such line on my deed, Mr. Redding." "A clerical oversight, I assure you," he purred, "easily rectified. The county will, of course, be taking control of the well immediately to ensure fair distribution during this emergency. A community asset." He was stealing it. In broad daylight, in front of everyone, he was using the town's desperation as his weapon against her. He thought she would crumble, a lone woman against the weight of official paper. But Elara had spent too many months doing the hard arithmetic to be frightened by a liar's figures. She was about to speak when a small, clear voice cut through the tension. "That's not true." All eyes turned to Pip. The boy stood beside a fence post, his knuckles white where he gripped the wood, but his gaze was unwavering. He looked directly at Redding. "I heard you," Pip said, his voice gaining strength. "Last month. You were talking to that surveyor from Clayton, behind the feed store. You said you'd pay him double to find an old easement on the Miller place. You said there was an old well there, and with the drought coming, it'd be worth a fortune." Redding's face went pale, then mottled with rage. "That's an absurd lie from a half-wit boy," he snarled. But the damage was done. The farmers looked at each other, then at Redding, their expressions hardening. They had seen his greed before. They recognized the shape of it. Pip's words had the simple, undeniable ring of truth. The spell of Redding's authority was broken. Just then, Maeve Thatcher pushed through the crowd. She walked right up to Elara, ignoring Redding completely. Her face was full of a shame so profound it was painful to witness. She did not look at the well. She looked at Elara. "We have nothing to trade," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Our credit at the store is gone. But my boys and I can work. We can mend your fences. We can clear brush. We are asking for your help." It was the moment the whole county had been waiting for. It was the pivot upon which her entire future would turn. She had the water. She held all the power. She could name any price. She could gouge the very people who had scorned her. She could become as hard and grasping as Redding. She looked at Maeve's face, at the humbled, hopeful faces of her neighbors. She looked at Pip, standing tall and true. She looked at the rich, dark earth her hogs had reclaimed. And she made her choice. She turned not to Redding, but to the assembled farmers. Her voice was not loud, but it carried in the still, hot air. "There will be no charge for the water," she said. A collective gasp went through the crowd. "But this is my farm, and there is work to be done." She pointed to the wall of Kudzu. "A day's honest labor for your family's water, a bucket for a chore. We will clear this land together. We will all survive this drought together." It was an offer not of charity, but of shared purpose. It was a solution that preserved both her dignity and theirs. A murmur of assent, of profound relief, rippled through the crowd. Men began to nod. One of them stepped forward. "I've got 2 strong sons. We'll start tomorrow." Redding stood frozen, his map flapping uselessly in the hot breeze. He had been rendered irrelevant. Shamed and exposed, He rolled up his map, climbed into his wagon without a word, and drove away, leaving a cloud of dust that settled on a town that no longer listened to him. Elara had won, not by fighting, but by building. The next morning, the work began. The Thatcher boys arrived at dawn with axes and scythes, their mother carrying a basket of freshly baked bread. By mid-morning, a dozen more men and women were there, armed with tools and a quiet determination. Elara, no longer a lone woman against a sea of green, became a general in truth, directing her new army. They worked with a focused energy born of gratitude and shared purpose. The sound of axes, the scrape of shovels, and the murmur of conversation replaced the lonely silence. Pip, clipboard in hand, organized the water line, ensuring every family got their fair share. He was no longer a silent shadow. He was a respected quartermaster.
Elara's principle of a bucket for a chore transformed the farm into a bustling hub of community. People didn't just take water, they invested their labor into the land. They cleared brush, split firewood, repaired the old barn, and helped build new, larger enclosures for the growing herd of hogs. The 85 acres of the Miller catastrophe were being reborn, not just by the rooting of pigs, but by the hands of the community that had once dismissed it. They were, in a way, atoning for their scorn with their sweat. In healing her land, they were healing the fractured trust of the town. The drought held for another 3 weeks, a final desperate gasp of heat and dust. But it no longer held the same terror. The well, which they now called Elara's Well, became the heart of the county. It was a place of work and water, of shared stories and quiet thanks. Elara insisted that Silas, who had shared his water freely before her well was found, would never have to work for his. His payment was to sit on her porch in the evenings, offering his quiet wisdom as she planned the next day's work. When Mr. Schmidt, the butcher, arrived to collect the first batch of contracted hogs, he found a scene that made him stare in wonder. The farm was neat and orderly, the barn repaired, and the hogs, fat and healthy, were being loaded by a half-dozen cheerful farmers. He weighed the general, whose leg had healed nicely, and whistled. 312 pounds, he declared. A fine animal. He paid Elara in crisp banknotes, a sum that made her hands tremble slightly. It was more money than she had ever held in her life. She took the bills, and that very afternoon walked into the county mercantile. She paid her debts, bought new boots for Pip, a bolt of good calico for his mother, and enough supplies to ensure her farm would be secure through the winter. She was no longer just surviving. She was thriving. The rains finally came in the 3rd week of September, not a tempest, but a soft, steady, soaking rain that smelled of clean earth and new beginnings. The whole town seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief. The creeks began to run again, and a faint blush of green returned to the parched pastures. The emergency was over. But something had fundamentally changed. The people who had worked side by side on Elara's land no longer saw her as a foolish outsider. They saw her as a leader. They had witnessed her quiet strength, her stubborn patience, and her foundational generosity. She had met their desperation not with greed, but with grace, and in doing so, had bound them all together. One cool evening in late October, Elara stood with Silas and Pip on the porch of her small house. A dozen acres of land now lay cleared and plowed, ready for a winter wheat crop. The garden was overflowing with a late harvest. The new hogs, offspring of her original sow, grunted contentedly in their clean, spacious pen. The air was crisp, and the setting sun cast a golden light over the land she had brought back to life. She was no longer a woman alone. She was the heart of a place, the center of a community she had inadvertently saved and rebuilt. "You know," Silas said, breaking the comfortable silence as he packed his pipe, "Redding sold his holdings. Moving out of the county, they say. Couldn't stand being a man with no one to look up to him." Elara just nodded, taking no pleasure in the man's defeat. Her victory was not in his failure, but in the thriving life all around her. It was in Pip's confident smile, in the healthy heft of her hogs, in the dark, rich soil waiting for seed. It was in the deep, unwavering certainty of the water that lay cool and silent beneath her feet. She looked out at the rolling hills, at the remaining ocean of Kudzu that no longer seemed monstrous, but merely a challenge yet to be met. Old Silas lit his pipe, the small flame flickering in the twilight. "My grandfather was right," he murmured, his voice raspy with smoke and age. "The land remembers. It just needs the right kind of farmer to listen." And in the quiet warmth of that evening, Elara knew she had finally learned its language.